Which one do you want to start with? You know what I'm going to recommend? Let's take a minute and look at the student work.
Okay.
Let's pull a few samples that help us think about any of these, and we'll make a decision where to start.
Perfect.
With that. So the things we might look at are the who's right and the issue of access and whether it was the right start and so forth. The matching went well, but what about individual understanding and what about closure? Looking at graphic representation and how to include that more thoroughly throughout the lesson, and generalization statements. Were they there? Why? If not, why not? Where would you like to start?
I think I'm interested in starting with the individual understanding piece, and to me, I'm seeing it related to generalization as we're talking. So
let's do that.
One I'd like to
What'd
talk
you pull?
about. So I pulled a couple of pieces. These two are from the table where you were focused for a little while with the 3 boys, and then a couple others where I just noticed students had made some notes. A lot of it are significant erasures of their matching, which I think is interesting. A lot of it, they're lines, and I know that having been there when some of those were drawn, there was conversation and there were other things that happened, but it's hard to tell from this written work exactly where those happened if I wasn't present. But it's a little different with these two, where I actually didn't spend a lot of time at this table talking to these guys, but they've got a lot of extra writing and little notes that they made on this sheet. So I can see some of them, this is where they started actually trying to figure out, well, what else would go there, and maybe working backwards a little bit.
I can say some of those are notes that they made or additions and changes they made after or while I was sort of interviewing them about their answers. So I observed them for, let's say, 5 minutes, and then they had flipped the paper and were working on the back, and I said, would you like me to check your work on the front? They said yes, and so we actually went through systematically 1 through 6, and I asked them to explain where their answers had come from. In a couple of cases, that's where Terrence had some different answers, so I pushed them a little bit on the idea that they needed to be checking with each other, but it's also where I got to hear individuals explain their thinking on it, and I think it's fair to say they have some different, well, just as you predicted, they have some different strength areas and some different gaps. Where do you, let's see, we were going to look at the generalization statements and at
Their individual.
Yeah. Closure. What?
So I mean, I think looking at this and realizing how hard it is for me to tell exactly where they were individually, I wish that I had stopped with enough time to be able to ask them to make some kind of their own summary, to write 3 sentences about first steps that were the things that came clear today that they want to remember when they come back next.
Just taking that 5 or 6 minutes at the end. Blow the whistle, stop. Separate piece of paper, or you do it at the bottom, or what do you like?
I'd probably have them do it in their notebooks, because that's where they're gathering things together. And a lot of my students have taken those with them beyond the class. So that
putting
would be
2 or 3 sample.
Yeah, sample problems, or I know to start with 0 when the directions look like. That was the generalization I probably heard the most as I was going from group to group of, well, if I'm finding x-intercepts, I know there has to be a 0. Or when they got to the other, for groups that were on the other side, if it's an x-intercept, it has to look like a point.
I wonder if listing some of these sentences would be useful. While you were doing the who's right warm-up, I think the first one is the one that you felt wasn't kind of grabbing them as much as you anticipated. It occurred to me that maybe having some sample sentence stems at the end of that, giving them the actual words. Looking back, I don't know if they were ready for sentence stems. I even wondered about pulling. A closure activity that occurred to me was that you could use the who's right that didn't go as quickly as you thought, pull that at the end and let them revisit it once they'd done some of these matching exercises.
It would be really interesting to see how many more reasons they could come up with at that point.
Or whether, how many more reasons, or whether the reasons came a little bit easier to them. But what about a couple of just brainstorming a couple of those sentence stems, or I'm sorry, a couple of the sample summary statements that you can imagine them writing? I think if you work backwards that way, what do you think they might be able to put in their notebooks at the end of the period today? And then work that all the way backwards to what are the sentence stems that you could give them at the beginning of the class for them to try out.
Right.
Let's just take a minute and brainstorm some of the summary statements. I think they're on the tip of your tongue. You said some of them already.
So things like, if I'm finding an intercept, I know that I need to substitute a 0. That an intercept is one where the answer looks like a point.
So if I'm finding an intercept, the answer looks like a point?
Like an x comma y or a t-table. Rather than an x equals.
So if I'm doing this, then let's try some of those.
Oh, that kind of statement?
If
I'm finding a vertex, I'm looking to find something in the middle.
Do you want to be more precise with the x part of that, or not at this point?
Like
in
the middle
vertex, I'm finding the middle of the x values.
Of the x intercepts, yeah, of the x values.
These three needed that from the beginning, but once we talked it through, once we talked it through, even once they had the first step of it, they were like, oh yeah, okay. And they fixed that one up.
At another table, we started talking about, so a vertex, where does it happen? If you know these intercepts, what do you do to find where the vertex is? And that's where they quickly said, oh, and they saw a number line. Oh, I need to find where that's going to happen.
I love that you made it one-dimensional with the number line. Don't even worry about the y value. And I think once kids see that and they have that, it's theirs and it's really important. I don't think it's obvious necessarily, at least at the first time. Let's do a couple more. If I'm finding the intercept, if I'm finding a vertex, the answer needs to look like, or I need to do this first step.
I don't know if they would have said this from this, but I would have loved it. Is if I'm solving a problem that's quadratic, it needs to equal 0.
What needs to equal 0?
The expression needs to equal 0. The quadratic expression needs to equal 0. Or I need to get everything on one side of the equation. The difference between that and the first step here, where we're starting to isolate things, but it's not the useful direction to move.
That was a really good example. Just to put it right out there, first thing to start with. And one more.
If I'm just factoring, I still have an expression. My answer is an expression.
I loved your idea of you need to know when to stop. I'm glad you can show off setting it equal to 0 and coming up with x values. But the answer is still an expression.
Thank you for writing these.
I'm sure there are more. I think that's a good start. Do you like this language, if I'm, then I, or if I'm?
I do, because it's kind of it's also modeling this conjecture language that helps later. If I can make this one decision, then I've got a bunch of things I know I can do next, or a logical thing I know I can do next.
Yes. I like having the I in it, that it's their own reflection or it's their own observation and statement.